And I click on that.
Hello, welcome to episode 15 of A Lesson Before Writing. I'm Ted Morrissey, one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with Brady Harrison. This is Brady's book, A Term Between, a collection of stories that won the High Plains Book Award. We are feverishly working on Brady's novel, A Journey to Al Ramel. We may touch on that again this session. And then also here with Grant Tracy, Grant's most recent book, Neon Kiss. But I'm actually also working on Grant's fourth Hayden novel, A Shoeshine Kill. And we're got that about halfway laid out. And so I'm kind of working with both these guys on that. So in anticipation of that novel coming out, I will remind our loyal viewers and listeners of Five Hard Bites, which is Grant's book that has the first three Hayden novels, Cheap Amusements and A Fourth Phase, and Neon Kiss, plus a novella and a short story. And so if you read Five Hard Bites, you'll be all ready to go when when A Shoeshine Kill comes out in a couple of months, hopefully. All right. Before we get any further, though, I want to give a shout out to John Paul Jaramillo, another 12 Winters author. John Paul's novel Carlos Montoya was an honorable mention in the International Latino Book Awards recently, as that's super cool. That's a mighty prestigious organization and award program. So to get an honorable mention was something. And then I'll also mention my most recent book is The Strophes of Job, out in paperback. And then my collection that came out last year, Delta of Cassiopeia, Collected Stories and Sonnets, is a finalist for the Big Other Book Award. And in fact, the awards online ceremony is tomorrow night. So we'll find out what happens with all that. But that was very cool just to get a finalist nod there. I'll stop talking here in just a second. But last week I had the honor of giving a reading in Chicago at the Albany Park branch of the library. And then tomorrow night I will be at Lincoln Land Community College for their Lit Fest. And I'll be reading there. And I've decided to read from my translation in progress of the Old English poem Beowulf, which I've been working on for years. And so I may touch on all of that. But I know, Grant, you had the reading, the staged reading of your play last weekend. How did that all go?
Oh, it went great. The play originally started as a one act, and I entered it in a contest, a Marshalltown Community Theater contest, and it won. It tied with some other play, but they decided not to perform it or do a stage reading of it. And so I was like a little disappointed in that, of course. Because it was a director's call, like the committee selected it, but then the director said, I can't work with this, it's not my cup of tea. And so I decided to radically revise it, and I didn't realize, but the one act became a full-length play. Like, I still thought it was a one act until we staged it, and it ran 75 minutes, which is perfect for today's especially community theater stuff. You do a 75-minute play and have two acts, and then you have a break for 15 minutes. People come to the show, and 90 minutes later they're heading home. So it's kind of a I don't know, it's like Robert E. Sherwood's Petrified Forest meets Ida Lupino's Outrage. And it's my own stuff, but there's some of these callbacks to those two texts, and it went really well. I mean, the biggest compliment I got, they had all us writers and the people involved in the other place sitting up in the balcony, so I didn't get to see the audience, but I did peek down below to see who all was there. And my wife, who was down below with a friend, said somebody said after my show, "Oh, that was actually pretty good." So I don't know. I don't know if they expected it to be crap or if it was something they were required to go for a course, literary citizenship, go see a show. But anyway, I took the compliment as it was intended. So I felt pretty good about that. I didn't know this person, but that was the take. And then I heard some nice things from people that saw it, and they said the dialogue really worked. The one thing I'll probably do when I revise it is, somebody said to me, "Oh, it was so you." And I took a bit of a step back on that and was like, I don't want it to be so me. Like, I know I wrote it, but I don't want the lead character who's a gangster to sound like Grant, the humanities guy. So, um, and I think that is a problem with the way I directed it, because I directed it, and so I'm going to work with the actor. I want to see him start off more reticent and reserved, and then start opening up as I want that to be his trajectory as a character. And I think it was maybe a little too soon that he was like he starts talking about paintings and he knows all this stuff about art. And I think that's okay, but he needs to struggle with the concepts of the way he's talking about it earlier instead of sounding like a college professor. So um
Mhm.
that was a big takeaway from this good friend of mine who loved it. But when she gave me the compliment, I was like, "Ooh, it's not quite working the way I want it to." So uh, we're going to make it into a film in February. Uh, I want snow on the ground, and and I'm looking for a farmhouse because it's the location's a farmhouse. I can do the interior in somebody else's house that can look like a farmhouse, but I need exterior shots of the farmhouse. So that's next on the agenda. And I want to set in the 30s, so there's a whole costuming and all that stuff because it's set in 1937. And the other influence on it, and Brady will know I'm talking about here, is More Joy in Heaven by Morley Callahan. It's a direct, not sequel, but it's kind of in dialogue with that short novel that I just absolutely love. So anyway, yeah. So it went really well. I'm super excited. Thanks for asking. It was a blast. And Gary Kroger, remember him from Saturday Night Live? He did say to me, he's in the Cedar Valley, he does local theater now, and he said, "You can write dialogue." I was like, "Thank you, Gary." So I took the compliment. That was very nice. So anyway, there you go. So
Absolutely. No, that's great. Congratulations on that and the film idea. You may have to go nowadays because of climate change. You may have to go to International Falls to find some snow in February.
we do get snow here. Like usually snow when I first moved here, first week of December, and now we get a white Christmas about every other year, and it's usually first second week of January it starts getting really cold. So January and February is a good time to shoot, you know, in the winter time. But I might just shoot exteriors in the winter and work with the actors in the summer. We can fake that stuff, the magic of filmmaking. So the goal is February, but I'll just see if I can get all my ducks in a row, all the costuming and all that stuff. It's a lot of pre shooting prep work to do. So hopefully I can
Yeah.
get that done.
Well, I'll be interested to hear the preps for that. So Brady, I don't think you've done a literary reading for a while, but you had that academic book come out. Do you do any sort of in-person promotion when you have an academic book come out, or is that just not a thing? I've had a couple of academic books come out, and I didn't do any sort of didn't schedule a reading of my Beowulf monograph or anything like that. But how do you try to promote your academic stuff?
Well, yeah, no, that's always the challenge. I do want to say though that I can see Grant as a rather gentle gangster, a kind of mild mannered Canadian, perhaps with a vicious heart underneath it all.
An assassin who kills with kindness.
That's right. Yes. And after he does it, he goes, "Sorry, eh? Sorry about that, there, bud. And it's terrible to make fun of ourselves, isn't it, Grant?
I love
Old,
it though.
old Canadian guys. Well, Ted, actually, what has happened most typically in the past when published a scholarly book, I'm, as like a lot of us are sort of part of the being in the profession, belong to a lot of professional or some number of professional organizations, and a number of those organizations have conferences. And so when the book's connected to Montana literature or the Teaching Western American Lit book came out, we did panels, rounds maybe with conversations between the contributors, and maybe a specialized panel on a more narrowly gathered group of excerpts from the book. And so in this case, it's about the book is Teaching Bob Dylan. And so Barry Falk that Grant knows very well. I think we're going to try to take our show on the road to the Dylan Conference. You know, since the Dylan Center opened in Tulsa and all his um, notebooks and memorabilia and the archive is there, and they're very active and they're well funded, and there's a Dylan Studies Journal now. Folks probably haven't heard of it widely yet. So yeah, we'll try to promote the book at the conference, and I suppose I'm hoping that Barry will be at some pop culture and music conferences as well. And so yeah, we'll take our show on the road. And the thing about scholarly books is that certainly in hardback, they're so expensive. It's hard for people to really, the only folks that can really afford them are libraries. And so I believe we're negotiating the paperback and the release date for a paperback version of Teaching Bob Dylan. So that way we can get it into more folks' hands. But so always glad to take the show on the road. Used to be, I'll just say, because we were talking about the aging thing, I used to be a lot keener on that when I was a young guy. And certainly go to any number of conferences and try to drum up some support. One of the things we might talk about, and I don't mean today, but and I've mentioned this in our podcast, and this is adjunct to my rambling so far, is I'm really fascinated by how folks go about promoting, say, a nonfiction book or a new novel or a collection of poems. And as I've become more connected with the writer community in Montana and in the Northwest, I've been fascinated and really keeping close track of how people arrange readings and how they work hard to promote their books. I'm not sure if I have that kind of stamina, or if any either of my truck or my car will take me far enough down the road to go all the places that they go. But the activity of getting out there and trying to make those connections with readers and get your book in their hands and in their brains. I've been trying to pay a lot more attention to that the last few years.
I mentioned I did that reading in Chicago. The full story there, full disclosure, I guess, is that was a local author reading, which I drove 5 hours to. So what had happened was there was a truly local author in the Albany Park area who wanted another local author to read with her. And I looked for recommendations, and a woman I know who lives in Chicago thought that I lived in the Chicago area too. So she recommended me. So I get this nice email inviting me to do this reading. And then I discover, well, it's because they think I'm a local author. Well, screw it. I'm going to go there. I haven't given a live reading in years other than at academic conferences. So yeah, so Northwest Chicago is about 4 hours from my house. But like I said, a solid 5 with Chicago traffic on the way there. But I was happy to do it, to read for 20 minutes because I'm just so desperate for a live audience. And then that library has a policy I've never encountered before, where they only let visiting authors sell copies of books that they already have in the system. And I don't quite understand where that comes from. But anyway, I do have a couple of books in the Chicago Public Library system, thankfully. So I could have sold copies of both Strophes of Job and then another book that came out in 2020, The Artist Spoke, which is set in Chicago. But I decided, you know what? I'm just going to give books away. So I brought a bunch of books of mine, and I brought you guys' books and a couple other 12 Winters books, and set them out on the table. And I just said, have at it. These are free. And I think I probably moved books to about 12, 10 or 12 readers. And I know that if I had charged, even at bargain basement prices, I doubt I would have sold more than 1 or 2 copies. So at this point, I'm way more interested in getting my books and your books into the hands of readers. And I figure I already am out gas money and meal money and the time and effort. who cares if I make $20, by selling a couple of paperbacks or something. So anyway, it's just hard, Here's, you mentioned having an older profession. The other reader and I were both, venerable. Now she had about the only people who were there were people who came to hear her read. I suspect the reason she wanted another local author was the idea that hopefully I could generate 8 or 10 or 12 friends, and so we'd have a pretty decent group. I didn't have anybody show up, on my behalf other than my wife. So that kind of didn't pan out very well for her. But the library is adjacent to Northeastern Illinois University. And so the place is just lousy with 20 somethings, late teens and 20 somethings. And the library itself, the public library right there, just filled with young people. And yet not one of them decided to wander in to see what was going on in this book reading or whatever. And, when I was that age, I would have, I think, taken advantage of that. If there was a free reading going on in the library while I was there studying, and I just think it's a sign of like shifting interests and so forth. But I don't know. It's hard to generate interest, especially among younger folk. And like I said, I think there are so many options for people these days that reading. So anyway, I'll stop yammering for a second there. Grant, what you got any thoughts on that? Giving away books versus trying to sell a few, or I know you had reasonably lower expectations at AWP, and you moved a couple copies and felt pretty good about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting the books out there to people, I think, is crucial. And what's the point of having them sitting around in my home? I've got so many copies of this book of mine and that book of mine. I think it's a good idea, and I don't know what to say about, I've seen it too. Like we'll bring in a really talented writer and they'll do a reading, and then they might sell 1 or 2 copies. And I'm like, whoa, this is like a great book, and people will show up at the reading and they just don't buy the books when the writer's done. So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Brady, any thoughts on any of that?
Oh, well, yeah. We know that we are dead sexy writers. We are sexy beasts. And this also, Ted, have had occasion to think about this, of course, over the last few weeks and months, that we take and it's a labor of love, and of interest. We take such care, I think, with our books and, with our writing. And so I guess what it reflects to me is a certain ambivalence. On the one hand, absolutely want folks to read our books. Our books are great. I am totally persuaded of great. I can't speak for my own work. I am totally persuaded of the quality of the work that we are doing. And I want it out in people's hands. And then on the other hand, I'm a little ambivalent about taking the show on the road and how to make that connection. Some friends of mine own an art gallery, and they say that you have to make the art, the connection to the art, personal. You have to somehow reach into that person. And so, I think about that, and I think that must be really hard. It must be really difficult. And so, despite the fact that we are sexy beasts, just, in every regard, how do you connect with folks? How do you get them interested in what you have to say? And it's challenging.
Well, and I feel somewhat hypocritical in the sense that, obviously, I do more than the average bear to promote like brand new contemporary writing. Obviously, I publish, you Sexy Beasts and other authors. I've got 12 Winters Journal that you guys help with and read for, and so I'm publishing brand new material at 12 Winters Journal online. Our podcast, every episode we feature a brand new story by a living author, generally speaking. But yet, in terms of book buying, in terms of the books I read, like a lot of us, I'm reading a lot of pretty old stuff. I mean, I've been reading my main fiction for the last several months has been Roberto Bolaño's the Savage Detectives. It's like 650 pages, so I've been inching my way through it. Or I'm reading stuff about Beowulf, which is my other big scholarly interest, or I'm reading Gass, William Gass again and again and again. I know you guys are reading older stuff. And so I think about that fact that the segment of the population that probably should be and would be interested in our books and other contemporary writers' books, they're spending all of their time reading the classics, especially if they're scholarly types. And I know, like Steve Davenport, your buddy, especially Brady, I think he has his tiny book club, as he calls it, online, where I think he's pretty good about buying brand new books by brand new authors and reading them and talking about them online. But he's a rare beast. I don't know even other contemporary writers who regularly buy books from small presses and read them and post about them. And I'm like right there. I mean, I don't do that, and I feel like I ought to do that. Let me kick it back to you, Brady, since I invoked Steve there.
Yeah, well, we never want to speak about Steve. Davenport? No, Steve. Steve is a wonderful poet, a wonderful nonfiction writer. He writes fiction. He can do it all, and yeah, he's got the tiny book club of one, and yeah, he reads really eclectically, and I really admire that. And of course, work as such. My reading obligations are pretty specific to my job. And so, but every other year I teach a graduate seminar on the contemporary novel, and yeah, I try to work in. Part of the reason why I do it is to try to keep up and get a chance, force myself to be able to set aside time to read new work and as much as I can work from small presses. But I will say that that does take some effort, right? It takes some concentration, takes some digging. So yeah, how do we get attention? But at the same time, it is the enterprise that we're engaged in. I wouldn't trade for the world, right? Like the great fortune that we have to be able to have time to write and to read. No matter what other complaints might have in life, certainly grateful uh, uh, for those opportunities.
Right. Yeah, Grant, do you have any thoughts on that? Reading contemporary work. Obviously, you're reading stuff all the time for North American Review.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I'm not making excuses for myself. When I read for North American Review, and I read a lot for North American Review and a lot of fiction, so I'm reading contemporary fiction. I'm thinking not so much as what I want to read as what's eclectic, what's different, what I want to get a good mix, of storytelling, types of stories, backgrounds of authors, but when I read for myself, I'm guilty of reading all the old school stuff, and I'm not thinking like a professor, like, oh, I gotta have this element of diversity in my class, and I gotta have. I mean, I read tons of crime books and old crime books, and that's where my passion is in my the little spare time that I have. So there are two different batches of there's all the contemporary short fiction that I read, and then there's for the magazine, and then I might occasionally, well, more than I do occasionally read something that's in New York Review of Books, or somebody is like raving about, like a latest updating. A few years ago I read a novel about F. Scott Fitzgerald, by Stuart Onan, and then there was another one that was a sort of a Nick Carraway World War One, story, and I read Percival Everett's, James, the reworking of Huck Finn, and so I'll find what might be a buzz, what people are talking about in the department, and I'll say, okay, I'll read that. But for the most, and I'm reading like Earl Stanley Gardner and Ed McBain and Raymond Chandler, like writers that excite me as a writer. to keep churning out the stuff I do. And I feel I get the balance by reading the contemporary stuff. So I have a hand in literary fiction and the style of literary fiction, and I can meld that with old school stuff that I read. So it helps me as a writer. I guess I'm often thinking it like I'm an AI generated person. Like I need all that to digest as many narratives as possible to write the narratives I write. So pretty focused on crime stuff. And I really like the old pre CSI stuff is kind of my thing, you know. So I feel a little guilty about that. Yes. I mean, I wish I read more small press stuff. But I'm reading writers that write for the small presses all the time, you know, with North American Review. So
Right. Well, speaking of academic stuff, as I've mentioned, I'm big fan of medieval literature, particularly the poem Beowulf, and I've been working on my own translation for a number of years. I wrote a monograph, about it. Came out in 2013 or whatever. But when so I've been a member of the Medieval Academy of America for a number of years, and when I retired in 2021, I guess it was, I'm not even sure. I volunteered my services as a book reviewer, specifically books about Beowulf, and so I've had a couple of assignments. And this past spring, they asked me to review a pretty new book out about Beowulf. According to the University of Toronto, by the way, which is the epicenter of Beowulf scholarship, a significant new article or book is published on the poem every week. So even specialists who that's all they do, they study and teach and write about the poem Beowulf, they have a hard time, keeping up with it. So one of the points of an academic review, as you guys know, is to describe it in such a way that specialists can read it and they can know if it seems like it's up their alley and has something that may be of interest to their particular focus or not. And so in that way, I'm doing a small microscopic contribution to medieval studies or whatever. But the point is, I guess, if I have one, is that, like I said, it took me like months to read that book because it was like 350 dense academic pages, much of it written in Old English. I really felt like I needed to read it carefully and annotate it carefully to write the review, and in the way that I should write it. So that was a major project. So that took me out of any kind of reading I might be doing for contemporary novels. So like you, Grant, I'm not trying to make an excuse, but there's just, so many books, so many reasons to read in so little time. So, hey, I want to get you guys' opinion on something while I'm thinking of it. When I did that Chicago reading last week, I asked, and they set up a computer and projector. I kind of by accident a few years ago when I was doing a critical paper at the Louisville conference, I ended up projecting like the paper. Like I always post my papers to my blog, and I had just had eye surgery pretty recently, and it was easier for me to read off the screen than it was paper. So I was going to stand there at the lectern and read off the computer monitor anyway. So I just pushed the button to project it onto the screen. And I thought maybe this is kind of cheesy or something. So I just kind of read through it and the audience, what little people were there, the few people were there. But afterward, several people like, man, I really liked that. I really appreciated that. And one of the people pointed out that it's really great for like people who have hearing impairments. They can read along. Also, anybody who's not a native English speaker, they probably have a little more difficulty following. And so since then, every time I give a critical paper, or like last week, I read a chapter out of my novel, I try to, if at all possible, project it onto a screen and let people kind of read along as I'm reading. And I've gotten just really, really good responses from that. I was at a conference about, 2 or 3 years ago at WashU, and most people who are giving papers, maybe some of them had PowerPoint, but a lot of them just read their paper as you would. And I have a really hard time getting anything out of that. And we went out to dinner, some of us, people I've been kind of friends with for a while. So I felt at ease to be myself. I said, you know what, I could not follow, that paper about Hegel or that paper. And people, I'm glad you said that. I didn't have any idea what that guy was talking about, And I've been to so many conferences where I've sat there and the people haven't even bothered to do a PowerPoint, and they're reading some really complex critical analysis of something, and they're quoting Hegel and Foucault, and like, fuck, I have no idea what they're talking about, you know. And in fact, when I went to the American Literature Association conference in the spring, I've gotten to the point where I would go into a presentation I was interested, and if I saw that none of the presenters were going to use a projector, I literally would just get up and walk out. I'd rather go to a presentation that I'm not even that interested in if the writers are at least going to present something, you know, PowerPoint or something. So anyway, I'm going to stop yammering here. But what are your thoughts about that, projecting the text, even verbatim, not just pulled quotes and not just an outline, but actually the text itself? Brady, I haven't picked on you for a while. Do you have any thoughts on whether that's couth or not at a reading? Have you ever tried anything like that?
I have not, and but I can assure you here from here on, I certainly will. I don't want to, seeing your very strong reaction, Ted. And anyway, even Hegel didn't know what Hegel was talking about. So let's just be honest. Was had occasion, of course, over the years to read Hegel and to read a little bit about Hegel. And I can say I never enjoyed a minute of that reading experience. And I read one anecdote. Of course, I have no idea if it's true, but Hegel, when in his role as professor, he would be speaking in class, and he would just stop, and there would be silence for minutes at a time. And so evidently Hegel was thinking. Can you imagine someone stopping to think? And I have no interest in Hegel.
Now the Hegel Society is going to
I'm gonna have to turn in my badge.
Podcast.
Yeah, when Grant, when we were in grad school, I took this sweeping introduction to Western thought, philosophy, and we had to read Hegel, and there was a lot of hard reading in that course, as you can imagine. Hegel to Derrida and Jameson. Who knows? And
Jameson can't write a fucking sentence. The guy's.
Well, you guys stop with the cursing. I a strong aversion, but yeah, Ted, I like the idea. I like the idea. I was going to go sideways on something else, which I won't, but. I'm gonna try that out from here on, if the room allows, if the technology is available.
Yeah, for me, because I do, when I've done academic-y stuff, it's usually been, film papers, and so I often do a clip, and that just can engage an audience, And when I first started, I would read the paper, and now I kind of just summarize it and have some point. I don't use. I hate PowerPoint, but I just summarize it, and then I haven't thought about putting that up on the screen. I love that idea, but I make available like a hard copy, my notes, and staple it together. If there's going to be 10, 14 people maybe there, and you can come up and get it if you're interested and it's got my name and my affiliation, university, and you can just take that with you. So you can go over the notes, and then maybe it'll stir up something that I've talked about. But doing the clip, it really helps. You got 20 minutes, you do a 7-minute clip, you talk for 12 or 13 minutes, bada bing, bada boo. It goes real well. That's been my experience. I love hearing fiction writers read their fiction, obviously, and poets read their poetry, but academic papers, like you were saying, Hegel, Schmegel, I start zoning out. So it's good to break it up. And I think the screen idea is a great idea, but I hate PowerPoint. Just got to say.
Yeah, I've never used PowerPoint.
I hate the way it looks. It just looks cheesy. Yeah.
I started doing this years ago, when I would go to conference, because even from the very beginning, I thought, because I really take it seriously. And I put a lot of time and effort into my conference papers and presentations, and then you go and, you present a paper for 20 minutes to, the other presenters and somebody's wife, and then it's like, that's it, And so I thought if I put them on my blog, at least people will find it. And actually they do. It's mostly, William Gass papers that are on my kind of academic blog or whatever, but they do get a lot of traffic. Now, I was never in a position where I wanted to publish them so I could get tenure or get full professorship, because I wasn't in that environment. So I know that's a drawback. I know if you are, an actual, real life academic, and you want to publish something, in a peer reviewed journal, that you don't want to publish it yourself online first. So I get it. I know that there are some reasons why some folks wouldn't want to do that. But anyway, I want to throw that out there because I stumbled across it completely by accident, and it's actually turned out that people really, really appreciate it. And I would appreciate it if more people would do it when I went to conferences and readings and stuff. And, and like, Brady's novel we're working on. I mean, I presume he's going to be giving some readings if we ever get that published. And even though we've toned down the physical representation of the text on the page, there's still a lot of stuff happening. And so I could see very definitely, Brady, when you give a reading, if you could project that and people could see, oh, well, that's how that's on the page, and they could get some sense of the typography. Whereas if you just read, without any sort of visuals, they wouldn't, have any idea. Even if you said, well, this is what's going on the page, without seeing it, they wouldn't really understand. So I don't know, what about that in particular, Brady? Do you think this new book that's coming out, do you think that would be particularly, the right turf for some kind of visual presentation?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great idea. There's so many mixes of genres and so many different, journal entries and letters and excerpts from travel logs, and it's a kind of compendium of, and so just to hear it out loud, folks would have the most difficult time, I think, and so that would solve and make some matters of it more accessible. And we talked last time we met. I just love books as objects. I like the look of things on the page and what the page can do and what the structure can do. And it is really difficult to get that reading aloud.
Mm-hmm.
Like how you can't see it on the page. So just as an aside, been listening to David Copperfield, an audio version, 39 hours long. And it's lovely to hear the voices, and the reader does a great job, so you can when, without having to be told quote or anything like that it's part of the dialogue. But I also flip through a paperback copy after I listen to a chapter. I flip back through the paperback so that I can see it, so that I can see the name, so I can see, because in particular Dickens, the way that he repeats phrases, he has a kind of several structuring techniques. I mean, he's got a lot of techniques, but a lot of structuring techniques, and it's fun just to see them on the page. And so, yeah, I'm definitely going to take advantage of your suggestion, Ted. And yeah, I think it would be great, if a projector is not possible, then to do Grant's thing and have a handout, which I have done in the past, so that people can see the thing on the page.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Grant, any follow-up thoughts on that before we move on to some other stuff?
Just real quick. I mean, just stuff I've said before, and Brady brought it up. Like when you're listening to books on tape or CD or whatever, you have the actor doing the voices, and you can tell. But like I notice, like with my work, when I read it aloud, people can't always tell when I'm sliding into summary and free and direct discourse and it's direct dialogue, because I play fast and loose with that. And if you don't, on the page, you can see quote marks, or, oh, there's no quote marks here. So is that an internal thought? Is that summarized dialogue? Is that free and direct discourse? And I love playing that way on the page, because, as I've explained before, I think crime books are full of uncertainty, and life's full of uncertainty. And so I like playing that game with my readers. But when I read it aloud, that gets lost a little bit in the translation. And I can put in some seds or whatever if I want to make it clear. I can make adjustments, but I can't make enough adjustments for people to just realize, not to brag, but the level of sophistication with which my prose is working on those levels. And it doesn't come across when I do a reading. People think it's really dialogue heavy, and it's really not. I'm doing different stuff, and that's what frustrates me sometimes when I give a reading, is that people aren't getting that nuance.
Well, another thing I did, which maybe, is, I don't know how useful it was, but, when I do a critical paper, oftentimes I do have visuals. I have I don't know, a photograph of something or whatever, and so I'll allude to them during the presentation. But for this reading last week in Chicago, I did, upload the thing I was reading to my website, or the 12 Winters website, actually. And, I make a lot of memes to advertise my book. So I have memes with like quotes from reviews and things like that. And so I went ahead and embedded, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 of those in the text of the story of the chapter. And I didn't allude to them during the reading. But as I was scrolling through, actually, my wife ran the computer because it was away from where I had to stand. But anyway, as the story was scrolling, those things would pop up. And it's almost like subliminal advertising or product placement or something. So they could read these wonderful things that people said about me in my book without me, saying, oh, by the way, Kirkus Reviews said. And again, does it make any difference? Does anybody then like go and get other books of mine? I have no idea. But at least it was a way to make that material used again, rather than just showing it on social media once or twice and then being done with it. So I don't know. Maybe there's something to that too. You can kind of sneak in some subliminal self-promotion or something like that. I want to plug something real quick, and this is completely out of the blue, but I got the new edition of Booth Literary Journal last week, number 19, and they had this extra little book in there. It's Table Talk and Second Thoughts, a memoir by Michael Martone. I believe that's how you say Michael's last name, and it's a bunch of like one paragraph little vignettes. I know only the video people can see this, but it's for those of you who are just listening, it's a little bit smaller format book anyway. And so each page is a separate little vignette, and it's kind of bounced all over the place year wise. Like this one says Visa Mexico 2000, the year 2000. And it's largely about his writing, his work as a writer, going and giving readings places, or being a guest lecturer, or teaching a summer workshop, and then also hosting people. So little anecdotes, a little story in there about driving around with Kurt Vonnegut and John Updike in the back of the car and the conversations they were having. Anyway, I just loved it. It showed up out of the blue, and I sat there last Sunday morning just mesmerized for a couple of hours. And so anyway, Booth number 19, Michael Martone. If you love the writing life and want a kind of inside look at some of that, and just some really amusing anecdotes, but also some very insightful kind of things too, insightful commentary, insightful description. So anyway, I just loved it. And I actually contacted Mike, who I don't know at all, and said, hey, I just read your book and loved it. I just wanted you to know. So, and I mentioned that I'd probably mention it in the in this episode of the podcast. So I did. Do either of you guys know him? He seems very well traveled. Grant, you're nodding. I think he's an Iowa guy, isn't he, or close to Iowa?
Like, I don't know about that, but I met him at AWP and went by his table and said hello, and got a new book of his. So I did buy a small press book. Yeah, he's a great writer, and he's for years been a contributing editor at North American Review. So
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Very cool. Have you crossed paths, Brady, either literally or any reputational mentions? Or
Yes, reputationally, of course. Yeah. No, have not had the pleasure of meeting, but I will certainly check out. And I wonder, so the book must otherwise be available and not just through the journal.
Well, it doesn't have an ISBN or a barcode or anything like that, as far as I can see. And so I don't think so. I think it's just a supplement to, maybe it will be eventually, or maybe it'll be part of a bigger book or something.
Wow. What a marketing idea.
Yeah, it's great. That's fun.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was such a nice, that happens occasionally like that. We did that, Forgotten Writers series or whatever, or whatever we did. We did a story out of that. That was Gulf Coast Magazine had published that series, and that little book came with that. So you get these little tidbits, these nice little extras, with these subscriptions to these journals, and it's always fun when those arrive and you've got something in there. Well, maybe this is a good segue to our featured author. Since I eventually have to get home here and get my 5-year-old to school, my 5-year-old grandson, I should say. And so we're going to talk about a a piece of fiction, and then we're going to get into some things about that, I think, in just a couple of minutes here, from Sand Literature and Art magazine, which is an English language journal published in Berlin, Germany. And this is actually the second time I think that I've pulled a story from Sand to have you guys take a look at for us to talk about on the podcast. I really dig this journal, and so it just happened to land in my mailbox like a day or two, or maybe the same day as we had taped our last podcast. And in that podcast, we had talked about integrating graphic images with text, and I had talked about particularly integrating some of my black and white, actually it was color photography into my novel, The Artist Spoke. And then lo and behold, this book shows up, and there's this intriguing little story called Little Miss Charlevoix, and it's by a writer, I'm going to say Thomas Heise, Heise. And I did try to figure out how to say Thomas's name. He doesn't seem to give any help where I found him online. And I found some people who do pronounce it Heise who have this last name. I found one person that pronounces it Heise. And I found one young lady who I think is a lacrosse player who pronounces it Heise, even though pronounces the S like a Z. So I don't know if it's Heise, and I apologize for Thomas to not know that, but I did try to figure it out. But it's a first-person protagonist who is talking about his hometown, which is Charlevoix, Michigan, and it integrates a lot of real information about the town, about current events at the time, like the JonBenét Ramsey murder, the little girl that was murdered because their house is just a few blocks away from the narrator's house. And then throughout the story, like I said, there are these photographs, and other than the photograph of Dolly, the cloned sheep, the other photographs within the story are taken by the author himself, and they are local attractions in the Charlevoix, Michigan area. So anyway, let me just kind of give you a flavor of this by reading from the beginning like I often do, and then we'll get into it here and see what these guys have to say about Little Miss Charlevoix from Sand, which is the issue number 27, summer 2024, so brand new stuff. It begins. I spent Christmas of 1996 bedridden in my father's spare room in Charlevoix, Michigan, with hives that appeared suddenly all over my face and chest the night before. I looked like I had been burned or exposed to a toxin in the air that didn't seem to affect anyone but me. My mother, a Jehovah's Witness, had stopped celebrating Christmas 14 years before when I was 11. She had stopped recognizing birthdays too, which in some weird way left me frozen forever on the cusp of puberty in her imagination. I had flown to my father's exhausted and on the edge of a nervous breakdown that I attributed to the strain of my graduate studies in California, but which I knew in truth originated in a deep sense of unease that I have felt as long as I can remember, and that for long periods of time I have been able to repress more or less successfully. His two-bedroom apartment, which was perched above the dusty antique and fossil shop he owned, faced the building that housed the post office, the police department with a single jail cell, and the mayor's office that oversaw the town of 3,500. John and Patsy Ramsey owned a second house, a sizable white Victorian with a demi-turret 3 blocks away on Belvedere Avenue, Charlevoix's most select street. It was that Christmas that someone strangled their daughter, JonBenét, with a cord the family had intended to travel from Boulder to Michigan the next day. Excuse me. So that's the first paragraph. And then as we go along here, the story kind of bounces between continuing that narrative thread of the protagonist being home, from graduate studies and what's kind of going on with his family, etc., and then cuts to places and so forth in this town that are locally famous, if not nationally famous, and then other kind of contemporary events like the reference to Dolly the sheep. And so I'm sorry, excuse me 1 second. Dry throat here. So anyway, so it's really a compendium of this protagonist's right reflections about this homecoming, about other things that are going on. There's a lot of literary name dropping and allusions and so forth, and so it's a very much a sort of gathering of all these different elements into this fictional narrative. And I'm going to stop right there and see what you guys want to say about this story, which is, again, a short story clearly labeled fiction in the journal. Brady, let me kick it over to you if you don't mind. What are you thinking about this story?
It was certainly interesting to read, and we were talking before we began recording. Where's the line between a nonfiction essay and a story, and how do you make that determination? Can you write a nonfiction essay and then call it a story? Can you write a story that borrows the narrative strategies and the ways of telling from nonfiction? Certainly you can. So yeah, I found this interesting, and one of the things I've been wondering about it and thinking about since I read it is the kind of pattern. Grant used this word, and I have never heard it before used, but this idea of beating, and so the ways in which the narrative in this case starts making reference to certain events, but then moves into the narrator's some more personal details about their life and relationship with their mother and relationship with their father and some of their own experiences, and then make references to Leopold and Loeb. And so there's a kind of way of sort of coming into and cycling back to earlier references. And I think sometimes that strategy is a kind of nearly mystical alchemy. How do you how do you keep interweaving those narrative strands, and at which moments is the right moment to bring things back into focus on this aspect of the story or the tale or the telling, and what other moments do you want to weave in together? And then some other times I think there's a way in which that pattern becomes it's less of alchemy, and it's just a little bit more of a certain kind of way of just making moves, and I'm less persuaded or less in love with that kind of feeling, and I don't know how to do any of that. I'm certainly happy to weave things together, but this particular technique that Grant describes, so I'll stop talking and pass it over to Grant. Sometimes I think it works, just with a kind of brilliance, and other times it just feels like, as I say, just a little too patterned, a little too expected in the moves that it's making. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Brady on that. Like there are moments in well, I'm going to call it an essay, the story. I mean, it's a hybrid, and this is a big thing right now. And in literary fiction, we see it everywhere. I do it with my crime stories. Blend literary fiction moves with telling an entertaining story. But for me, at times, that the beatedness does feel a little too academic-y to me. Like, okay, here's this move. Now, how am I going to end this piece? And I don't want to give away the ending, but I felt it needed some kind of trick like it used for the ending to close it all up, to bring it back to the personal, and then the sort of tie it in with JonBenét Ramsey and Patsy and moms and children and offspring. And I read for the Terry Tempest Williams Prize every year at North American Review, and I would have easily have thought this was a creative nonfiction piece, because I read a lot of essays structured like this, where there's a lot of research and then something kind of personal that threads it together, and then we try to make sense of it somehow, bring it all together at the end. A kind of creative nonfiction version of of an epiphany, if you will, a Joycean move, of course. So I think there's a lot of real strengths to the piece. And I was fast. I mean, I ended up going down a few wormholes, checking up on the facts, and the facts are all right. There was those twin dolls. There was one done for the Ramses. It is a collectible, much sought after. And the doctor behind it, that was the theory, the Leopold and Loeb case. I knew a lot about that already because I'm a crime buff, and I've read Compulsion, which I can't remember which one of the two guys didn't get murdered in prison, but one of them was really mad and tried to sue the writer. I think it was Leopold didn't get murdered, Loeb did. Anyway, Leopold tried to sue, and he lost that case. And anyway, so I was digging all that, but it just didn't all hang together for me. That's it was, it felt academic-y. I wanted to be more entertained than I was.
Well, I really like it. I really enjoyed it, which is one of the reasons I sent it to you guys. Like I said, I was attracted partly. It caught my eye because of the integration of the author's photographs with the text. But beyond that, it reminds me very much of writing by my literary idol William Gass. His mega novel, The Tunnel, which took him 26 years to write, is about a university professor named William Kohler instead of William Gass. And he teaches at a university that very much looks like Purdue University, which is where Gass was teaching when he started writing the novel. And so there's a lot of correlation, and it's very literary heavy. There's all sorts of references to Rilke and other kinds of writers, and so there's a lot of that going on. And one of the things that happened when The Tunnel came out was because the first person narrator was so close in many ways to the actual author. The name was similar, William Kohler versus William Gass, university professors and blah, blah, blah. But William Kohler is kind of a monster. In fact, he's kind of anti-Semitic, or not kind of, he is anti-Semitic and not a very pleasant person. And a lot of reviewers had a hard time disassociating the author, William Gass, from William Kohler. And so a lot of people assume that William Gass has been this closeted anti-Semitic all these years and blah, blah. And Gass's reaction was, well, they're not very good readers. That if they can't separate the difference between the protagonist, the narrative voice, and me as the author, then they're just not very whatever. But that's, you run that risk. The closer you are as an author to the protagonist that you are creating, you're obviously blurring that line between what's fact and what's fiction and what's real and what isn't real. I mean, we all do it to a degree, but I guess there's kind of a continuum. And this piece is maybe closer to the edge where it's harder to differentiate between fiction versus nonfiction and so forth. Now, again, I really, really love it. I mean, I think it's kind of a meta or a postmodern move in many ways. I'm reminded of Vonnegut's fiction, which oftentimes kind of straddled just, overt memoir and then, sci-fi narrative or whatever it might be. And so I like that style. I like that kind of pushing the envelope and asking the question of what's fiction and what isn't fiction. But obviously it's a very, people's reaction to it is very idiosyncratic, whether they really go in for it or don't go in for it or what have you. I don't know. I'll stop talking and see if any of my yammerings there spark any reactions from you guys. Brady, let me go back to you.
Oh, well, I just in listening to your take, Ted, I think I feel more warmly towards the story, perhaps than Grant. I'm not speaking for Grant here. And I find it interesting, and I like as a reader, and we've talked about this, I like works that put pressure on the reader. I like to write that kind of way. And one of the things thinking about in this story, because of the particular factual matters that it brings in, Leopold and Loeb and the murder of a tiny girl, JonBenét Ramsey, and the speaker is another one of those reminded me of the story from last time. That sort of the voyeuristic, and then and a portrait of a pretty sick America. A portrait of affluence and destructiveness. And then there's something really creepy about my twins and the way that after, if Grant says this is true, but at least it's told so in the story, that after JonBenét Ramsey's death, people found out that she had one of these, Creepy Valley oversized dolls of herself, and that people then ordered it. And so I thought the story hit pretty hard in some of those same ways that the previous story had, about the kind of sickness, or I don't even know what word to use for anyone who would order my twin of a dead girl. So in that way, there certainly is a kind of power at play in the story. So I don't know, Ted, if I just totally zigzagged when you asked me one question, I answered another, but I do find some very grim yet powerful look at some of the dark and bitter heart of America.
Well, I definitely want to bring Grant in here, but excuse me, you're kind of focusing on JonBenét's twin doll. I just wanted to kind of point out that there is this interesting thing going on in the story that I really liked, where there's a lot going on with twins and the idea of doppelgangers. And there's a whole section of people who thought they had seen themselves, and then that maybe is a harbinger of their own demise, or they see someone close to them who isn't really there, but then anyway, there's a lot of really interesting parallels. And I think I'd have to read this story several more times to really start to see if I can pull out of that. But it's obviously a deliberate artistic move to embed within the text, even though the references are all to real things. They are referencing things that kind of run in parallel, and again, doppelgangers and twin dolls and blah, blah, blah. And in that way, it reminds me of sort of found poetry, which I'm a big fan of. I know there are some people who find that an oxymoron, found poetry, that if you just find the text somewhere, you're not really being a poet. But I think to see text in a poetic way, even if it's appearing kind of naturally in the world, that's a skill unto itself. So in many ways, there's kind of these found elements in the story that I think Thomas is weaving together in really interesting artistic ways. Grant, what are your thoughts about that, or anything else?
Well, no, right on. I loved all the stuff with the doppelganger, John Donne, and there was a description that was really, really cool. He describes Leopold and Loeb walking around like they're looking over the estate, this whole area, but arms around each other's shoulders, legs together, in step. These legs kind of friction, which has that whole sexuality thing that was going on between the two of them. And it was a great description, I thought, of sort of the doubling, but the oneness of the two, and then how the one character made a comment about when the other one's eating, he wishes he could take in the food, something like that. I thought that was awesome, and I agree. There's a lot of doubling throughout. There's what's that guy's name? That cat, Goethe. Is it Goethe that's in there? So yeah, I thought that was good, and this is why at North American Review, we editors don't all have to agree when we accept something. We respect each other enough that if Jeremy likes something and I'm not a fan of it, I'm not saying I'm not a fan. I'm saying I'm not crazy about the story, but I want to be clear here. If Jeremy says I want this in the magazine, it's in the magazine. That's kind of the way we roll, because we know what might not be my cup of tea might be Jeremy's cup of tea, Rachel's cup of tea, Adrian's cup of tea. So we respect that about each other, and give each person. There is no veto. There is no editor that steps in and says, no, you can't have that in the magazine. If you really, really want it and you're part of the editorial team, we're going to put it in. So that's why we do that, because, I might say no to a piece, but Jeremy might say, "Hey, Grant, I think you missed the boat on this one, bro," and I love it. And that's totally cool. So yeah,
Well, I was part of a literary journal editorial team a few years ago, and I know I would be frustrated because I would read something that I really, really loved and thought it was wonderful, but then we get into our editorial meeting and I would be outvoted, and meanwhile somebody else thought was fantastic. I thought, really? It's got all kinds of plot holes and pretty cliche, but democracy rules or whatever. And so that's when I started 12 Winters Journal, and I got you guys and some other great people on the team. And you can set it up that way. You can set up for readers that they score something, 1 to 5 or something, or various ways. But I just went with, you guys are going to say yes, or you're going to say no. And if one person, and you're the only reader, by the way, so if you say yes, it's in the journal. If you say no, better luck next time, because I respect your opinions, and I realize that it's idiosyncratic, but yet I don't really like this I don't know, negotiating for things to get into a journal and people being
hate it.
outvoted, and yeah, I just think that's a bad approach to the whole.
I do, and you get people with big voices who fill up the space in the room, and sometimes they sway everybody with their one opinion. Like, I have a visiting writer, a former student of mine, a good friend of mine. He's coming to give a talk tonight. I'm going out to dinner with him, and then he's going to give a reading. And we read a couple of his stories in class yesterday and talked about them. It's Mark Dickinson, by the way. We published him in 12 Winters and his collection of replacement parts. And the students really didn't like a character, a cop, in one of the stories. They say he crossed all kinds of lines. And I'm like, I quoted Charles Baxter. I said, characters don't have to be moral. They just have to be interesting. And I said, I find this character extremely interesting and engaging. And I'll be honest with you, maybe I have lots of empathins, but I like this guy. I find him, he's a human being, and but it was just funny that we talked about this a little bit, but it was like this moment of cancel culture where because this character was ick, in some ways, they just wanted to cancel the story. And I think it's a beautiful story. And that's the kind of thing that can happen in the group think, with some strong voices. And suddenly, now we do at North American Review, because we teach a practicum, I might have the students all together, read, say, 40 stories that are in the queue. Okay. And then we'll talk about it, and they'll make suggestions, but they don't have final cut or right of refusal. They just make suggestions, and then I still decide what might or might not be in the magazine. But I give them the chance to see the fiction that comes in, get a feel for it, what's out there, what they can do, and then give them a voice. And I listen, and sometimes they do convince me of something to take, but that's just happens occasionally in the practicum class. But the other way the magazine works is exactly what you were describing, Ted. If I like it, it's in. If Jeremy likes it, it's in. We don't pull Trump on people and get into a big powwow and then decide. I just hate that stuff. I hate groupthink stuff.
Hey, I hate to cut us short, and I'm sure our listeners hate that too, but I do have to get a kid to school in a half hour. So let me read Thomas's contributors note here, as I like to do. Thomas, and again, Heiss, apologies to Thomas if that's not right, is the author of the lyrical novel Moth and the poetry book Horror Vacui. He has also published 2 academic monographs, The Gentrification Plot, New York, and the post-industrial crime novel and urban underworld, a geography of 20th century American literature and culture. He lives in New York City. I didn't find a website, but he's a professor, so he has an academic page at his university's website. And he's also on X. And I noticed on X that he says something like the opinions expressed by his doppelganger are not necessarily his. very much into this whole twinning doppelganger thing. So, good for him. But definitely check out Thomas's sites and his books, and check out Sand, this particular journal. Again, I unfortunately have to kind of cut this off, but let me throw it back to you guys for a final, hopefully kind of brief word before I hit stop record. Brady, what are your kind of final thoughts here?
Oh, well, just to go back we didn't pursue this as much as we might, but the line between fiction and nonfiction, I'll just say what I already said. Like I like stories that push you around, that give you some uncertain ground to stand on, that are sort of getting you to think in different ways, and even just wondering about genre itself and about the presentation itself. So those are interesting keeper strategies, I think, for our auditors or watchers when they're thinking about possible ways to press the complexities of genre and take some experimental risks. This kind of story definitely is a matter of interest.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Grant, final words here.
I think Brady said it real well in support of the story. The blurring of those lines. I think it is important to keep doing that. And if it's not necessarily my cup of tea, doesn't mean it's not deserving of being out there and deserving of praise. I mean, we just all have different tastes and aesthetics, and I think as readers and editors, we have to be aware of that. This is the kind of story that if I had read it alone, right, I would ask for a second opinion, because I would realize it doesn't speak to me, but there's something in it that's really damn good. And that's when I would take it to Jeremy, and whatever he would think, I'd roll with. It's not when I would just reject because it's not my bag, right? I mean, I recognize really good work when I see it, and there's really good work here. It just, it gave me some dissonance, and then I would go to somebody else because I wouldn't feel comfortable just rejecting it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate your time this morning. I appreciate our listeners and viewers. And hey, next month is October. I think we should do another Halloween-inspired episode. So be thinking about that for the next couple of weeks, and I'll be in touch with both of you guys. All right. Hit stop record and watch for us in about a month or so.